There are 4 movies that will tell the story of the Beatles, each through the eyes of another one of the Fab Four. Producer Sam Mendes has a chance to set the record straight. Myth number 1. The Beatles were an overnight success. The idea that the Beatles became famous overnight ignores years of struggle. Before landing their first record deal, they endured grueling sets in Hamburg, playing for 8 hours a night, 6 days a week, to crowds that barely noticed. Decca Records rejected them in 1962, infamously saying guitar groups are on the way out. Even after signing with Parlophone, their first single, Love Me Do, was a modest hit, barely breaking the UK top 20. Their true breakthrough didn't come until Please Please Me topped the charts, but they still had to conquer America. Their Ed Sullivan Show appearance in 1964 finally made them superstars, but by then they'd played over 1,000 live shows. Mendes needs to show the grind before the glory. Myth number 2. John Lennon was always the rebel, Paul McCartney was always the soft one. The idea that John was the raw, rebellious genius, while Paul was just the melodic, soft one, is an oversimplification. John wrote some of the Beatles' most tender songs, like Julia and In My Life, while Paul pushed the band into avant-garde experiments like Carnival of Light and the tape loops on Tomorrow Never Knows. John could be deeply insecure, while Paul was often the one holding the band together with sheer ambition and drive. Their dynamic was more than a simple contrast. They balanced each other out. Paul had his cutthroat moments, and John had his introspective, poetic side. Mendes needs to go beyond the surface myth and show the full complexity of their partnership. Myth number 3. Yoko Ono broke up the Beatles. Blaming Yoko for the Beatles' breakup is an easy narrative, but the truth is way more complicated. By 1968, the band was already falling apart. Business disputes, creative tensions, and personal differences had created deep fractures. Paul was frustrated with John. George was tired of being sidelined. And Ringo even quit temporarily. John and Yoko were inseparable, but that was more a symptom than the cause. John was already detaching from the Beatles. Yoko was controversial, sure, but the Beatles' split was inevitable. Mendes should ditch the lazy scapegoat story and show how the breakup was a slow-motion implosion of personal and business struggles. Myth number 4. The Beatles hated each other by the end. Yes, things got messy during the breakup, but the Beatles were never just enemies. They were brothers. The Let It Be sessions showed tensions, but they also had plenty of laughter and great musical moments. Even after the split, they kept crossing paths musically. Ringo played on John's, Paul's and George's solo records, and George and Ringo even co-wrote Photograph. John and Paul had their feuds, but they reconnected in the mid-70s, even jamming together privately. By 1980, John spoke about working with Paul again someday. Mendes needs to show that the breakup wasn't the end of their bond, just the end of the band. Myth number 5. Ringo was just the lucky one. The idea that Ringo was just the guy who got lucky ignores his huge contributions to the Beatles' sound. His drumming was instinctive, precise, and uniquely creative, shaping classics like Come Together and A Day in the Life. Before Ringo, the Beatles struggled to find the right drummer. His addition completed their sound. Even outside of drumming, he had a signature voice, with songs like With a Little Help from My Friends becoming timeless classics. John, Paul and George all knew the Beatles wouldn't have worked without Ringo, and they openly admitted it. Mendes needs to make sure Ringo isn't just the extra in this story. He was essential. Number 6. George Harrison was always the quiet one. George wasn't just the quiet Beatle. He was sharp, funny and fiercely independent. He often challenged John and Paul's dominance, fighting for his own songs and proving himself with classics like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps. He had a wicked sense of humor and wasn't afraid to push back in interviews or recording sessions. George's deep spirituality also set him apart. His love for Indian music and philosophy shaped the band's later sound. While he didn't always speak the loudest, his music and influence did the talking. Mendes needs to drop the quiet one label and show George as the bold, pioneering artist he really was. Myth number 7. The Beatles only wrote happy, innocent songs. The Beatles weren't just about love songs and catchy tunes. Their catalogue is filled with dark, surreal and controversial themes. Eleanor Rigby tackled loneliness and death. Happiness is a Warm Gun referenced violence and addiction. And A Day in the Life painted a haunting picture of society's emptiness. Even She's Leaving Home was about a teenage runaway, not just a sentimental ballad. The idea that they only wrote safe, happy songs is just wrong. Mendes needs to highlight their darker, more experimental side, because the Beatles were more than just yeah. Myth number 8. Paul McCartney didn't experiment like the others. Paul gets labelled as the pop guy, but he was just as experimental as John or George. He pushed the Beatles into psychedelic rock, pioneering Sgt. Pepper and writing some of their weirdest tracks like Helter Skelter, often considered the first heavy metal song. He also experimented with electronic music, avant-garde sound collages and tape loops, influencing songs like Tomorrow Never Knows. Even after the Beatles, he continued pushing boundaries with early synthesizers and bizarre projects like The Fireman. Mendes needs to drop the myth that Paul played it safe and show him for what he was, a musical risk-taker. Myth number 9. The Beatles never wanted to reunite. People assume the Beatles were done forever after 1970, but they came close to reuniting multiple times. In the early 70s, they received massive offers for reunion concerts, including a $50 million deal in 1976. They also had secret jam sessions. Paul even visited John in 1974, and they played together privately. Even John, in one of his last interviews, said he could see them working together again. If not for John's tragic passing, who knows what could have happened. Mendes should show the moments when a reunion was possible, instead of making the breakup seem like a permanent, bitter ending. Myth number 10. The Beatles were just a 60s band. The Beatles weren't just the biggest band of the 60s, their influence never stopped. Their production techniques shaped modern music, their songwriting inspired hip-hop, indie, and electronic artists, and their legacy still dominates pop culture. Tracks like Come Together have been sampled by dozens of artists, and Paul and Ringo still perform to sold-out crowds. Even AI-generated Beatles songs prove that their sound is still evolving. The Beatles weren't just a band of their time, they changed music forever. Mendes needs to show that their impact didn't end in 1970. It's still happening today.
Have something to add? Hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for more Fab 4 factoids.